Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Today we're going to be talking about something that's very vital for any of us who are beginning to pursue our little sow our oats in entrepreneurship. The book is called The Age of the Platform, and this is to talk about how Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google have redefined business. And we should too, especially with today's technology. On our program today is our guest, who is a recognized technology expert and sought-after speaker. He consults companies on how to optimize their use of technology. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today a guest for The Age of the Platform, which is the title of his book, Mr. Phil Simon. Phil, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Hi, Daniel. Nice to be here.
Now, this is a pretty daunting book that really gives you a real eye-opener and makes you kind of wonder, geez, do I even have a shot? Tell us about what's going on here.
Well, sure. I mean, it's, I think, very difficult to look at a company like Facebook and go, well, how can I be the next Facebook? But let's not forget that Facebook didn't start off with 850 million users. It started off with one. So I really wanted to write a book, Daniel, that talked about the evolution of these companies and, more important, explained how any company of any size can embrace some of the concepts in the book.
Mm-hmm. I know what was interesting is you talk about the big four, and that is Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Google. And it's pretty unique to realize that when people probably kind of take a look at those four, they might see slight differences, but the truth is, as you go into detail of the book about each of those companies, there are some amazing differences between what they do. And Amazon, actually, to me, was really a highly innovative company. I mean, I give Apple its due. I just finished reading a book about Steve Jobs, actually. The journey is the reward, and most people, of course, they associated Apple with a computer, but then you started seeing the innovation, especially after Steve Jobs came back to the company. But Amazon was really an amazing one when it came to customer service, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, they're all innovative in their own ways, and you're right, Daniel, there is no one recipe. In fact, if you want to contrast Amazon with Facebook, I think that those companies, while both innovative, demonstrate that there is no one right way to build a platform. For instance, Amazon back in 1995, 1996 was all about getting big fast.
Mm-hmm.
So they understand this notion of first-mover advantage. Contrast that with Facebook, and if you read, say, David Kirkpatrick's book, The Facebook Effect, which I thought was a lot better than the movie, The Social Network. Mark Zuckerberg intentionally held back Facebook because, quite frankly, the company wasn't ready for it yet. It didn't have enough servers. It didn't have enough sort of scale. And it was only going to launch back in schools when it could support sort of an optimal user experience. So Facebook, as you know, wasn't the first social network. You had Friendster, you had MySpace, you had Classmates.com. So it's interesting, and this is one of the reasons I wrote the book. I didn't think that there was necessarily this 10-step checklist to follow, and I enjoy books like that. So how can I make people understand what's going on and shed some light on it? But again, I'm not smart enough to say if you do these 5 things, you'll be the next Apple.
I don't think, though, in some of these cases that, the people, I would say, well, let's say outside of Apple, maybe I'm stretching here a little bit, really had imagined, I mean, they had the idea, but they had imagined their companies would become what they did. They just knew, they said, here's an idea, and in most cases were ideas that people had already created. This wasn't like somebody just sat there and said, ooh, Amazon, or, in Apple's case, ooh, we're going to build a computer. These things were already in existence. They just took a look and they, bing, the light went on and they went off and they went running.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things had to converge. If you take a look at Apple with the iPod, and I just finished reading a Stephen Levy book on the history of the iPod, Apple did not create the first MP3 player, right? Mm-hmm. There were 20 or 30 before, but Apple nailed it. And along those lines, it wasn't just about creating a great device, right? I mean, ditto Amazon with the Kindle, it wasn't the first e-reader. If you take a look at the Sony e-reader, which I think launched in 2006, it was a good enough device, but there weren't a lot of electronic books for it. So that touches on one of the things that I discuss in the book, this notion of ecosystems. You create a product or a service, but it has to exist in the outside world. So you want people creating apps for it. You want music companies or artists making their songs available, and iTunes was a great vehicle for that. You want, if you're Amazon, the publishers to make their books available on Kindle, so it's not just about having a great device, it's about consuming content. So it isn't just about doing things internally, it's about embracing uncertainty, it's about external innovation, and those are some of the key themes that I talk about in the book.
Mm-hmm. Now, first let's go ahead for our listeners and describe exactly what a platform is. And that being said, I know that, as I was reading through, I began to feel a little daunted, like, do I need to really create a business that, seemed to be up to date with technology when you might think of little Susie out there in her 40s or 50s that says, but I like to sew. How this could apply to somebody like that when they want to serve the world in what seems to be more of a basic thing rather than a search engine or creating applications or selling multitudes of things online. But let's start with the platform first and then kind of move in that direction if you could.
Sure, Daniel. I really thought that it was important for me to define that very clearly because, unfortunately, platform has become a buzzword. It means many things to many people, so I make it very plain early in the book. To me, a platform is just an integrated set of planks, which, of course, begs the question, what's a plank? And to me, a plank is an individual product or feature or service. So just by way of example, Amazon in 1994 wasn't a platform company. It was an online bookstore, and it became a platform. Well, how did it do that? It got into the hardware business with Kindle. It started selling cloud computing services to small businesses. It became a publisher. It started selling music and movies and DVDs, and then the online streaming. So those were the types of things that made it become a platform. Ditto Google in 1998. It was a search engine. It became a platform by adding planks like Gmail and YouTube and Blogger and Maps and all of these different things.
Yeah, and that's what I was getting at, too, is, here maybe somebody out there has, a business that, for instance, somebody who sews or creates costumes, how they can think beyond, or at least within the scope of the platform, because in here you get this feeling like, well, if I don't have a technological platform, how do I even survive, stay buoyant, or even become successful with a business that serves people in that essence?
Right, and I think it's important to distinguish a few things here. There have always been technological platforms going back 30 and 40 years. I'm talking about the platform as a business model, and to that end, even small business owners really ought to be thinking about adding different planks, and I'll use myself as an example as I do in the book. Up until 2007, 2008, I made 99% of my income as a small business owner from one very specific type of consulting. And around 2008, I started to wonder, is this sustainable? And decided that it wasn't. So I sort of blew up my own business model and launched these different lines of business. Now, I don't know anything about sewing, so I didn't launch a sewing business, but because I'd done consulting, I got into different types of consulting. I got into website design. I started writing books. And when you write books, you might have an opportunity to speak about those books.
Okay.
And I started a publishing company. So I launched these parallel lines of businesses. And to me, I don't know going into a quarter or a year which ones will be successful. Maybe my book will sell thousands and thousands of copies and I can sit on a beach drinking fruity drinks with umbrellas in them. Maybe they won't sell at all and I'll have to do more website design. So I embrace the uncertainty. It'd be kind of like, say, if you're at a bar and you're chatting up a woman for 4 hours, it may not go anywhere. Well, okay, maybe if you talk to more than one person, or say at a networking event, you may actually wind up finding someone who's interested in your company's services. So it's less about focusing on one thing. In the book, I sort of reject the GE model of just doing one or two things. And I'm not alone. Google, if you take a look at it, is absolutely preparing for a world in which people don't use search as much. And in fact, if you look at the statistics, Daniel, something like only 24% of all time on a mobile device is spent doing a traditional index or Google search. Mm-hmm. How does Google stay relevant in an era in which people on their mobile devices, whether they're smartphones or tablets or something else we haven't thought of yet, are using these devices in very different ways? Well, enter the platform in these different planks. So that's some of what I talk about in the book. Yes, it's important to embrace technology, but I'm a big believer that a chiropractor or a restaurateur can also embrace the platform fundamentally as a business model.
Okay. So a good way to be able to define this for our listeners out there who may think, okay, platform, I'm still not getting it, it sounds like Greek to me, is to be able to take whatever your service is or your product may be and find multiple streams of income to be able to reach the end user. Is that pretty much what it is?
Sure, and different
Okay.
users,
Right.
And that it
Okay.
embraces this notion of uncertainty. For instance, and one of my clients is a chiropractor, or I should say he still is a chiropractor, but we started talking, and when I was redesigning his website, it was just xyzchiropractor.com. I said, well, we need to just think bigger. So he launched a massage practice, a chiropractic practice he already had, but also acupuncture, also diet, because it was all related. So then he launched a new website. I got him going on the social media channels because to him it was silly. You go to the chiropractor and you might need a massage, you might need acupuncture, your back might hurt because you're 35 or 40 pounds overweight. So why not think about it holistically?
Mm-hmm. Even furthermore, Phil, I was going to even add to that, there's a pretty famous chiropractor that was featured in the movie What the Bleep Do We Know? And he's just recently produced a book about the power of the mind because he's explored neurosciences, for instance. And this book is really going to take off, to be quite big. But here he was in a movie, talking about things such as physics and the belief in how we create our own realities. You wouldn't kind of weigh and measure that a chiropractor, what would he be doing in an area of physics? But, like you said, that's an element of a platform that diversifies him.
Yes, diversification I think is important, but I think it's also important to take calculated risk.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, I'm a consultant, an author, a web designer, a public speaker. I don't give ballet lessons or sewing lessons. I don't know anything about
Although it might be cute.
Right. So I think it's important to, I had a housewarming party here where I live in Las Vegas a couple of weeks ago, and the guy who did the catering is actually also a private investigator. Now, to me, that's the exception that proves the rule. There isn't a lot of overlap when I have the guy serving the antipasta or the chicken, and oh, by the way, can you investigate somebody because I think this person's cheating on me?
Well, investigate where the salami or whatever comes from anyway.
Right.
What I really like, too, is when you take a look at the age of the platform, first of all, you get that real meaty center section what goes into pretty much the detail without, a super long history of each of the big four that you talk about. And I know that in there, as people read this, that it could click some ideas that as smart as these companies are, because you also talk about how they're starting to suffer brain drains, which I thought was pretty interesting. But it's, likely when somebody grows and people spin off and they're making a bunch of money, they decide maybe I'm going to go do something else. But the thing is it can actually kind of even inspire you, as daunting as it seems to read about these histories, like, I wonder if they thought about this yet. Go and explore it, and kind of get amazed by that. To you, what really stood out of the four that you thought to yourself, wow, this is pretty amazing?
Oh, gosh. I mean, they were all so remarkable on their own levels.
Right.
I think that if there's one thing that maybe just off the top of my head kind of stands out, it's that these companies all grew by virtue of these very iconic leaders. For instance, Facebook isn't a democracy. In fact, when it goes public, Mark Zuckerberg is going to own 57% of the voting shares.
Mm-hmm.
Apple was Steve Jobs' company, and now it's interesting to watch Apple succeed, even though he's obviously passed away. Ditto Jeff Bezos with Amazon, or with Larry and Sergey, and to some extent Eric Schmidt with Google. Traditional companies, I think, often become these sort of hodgepodges of democracy and bureaucracy, and as a result, nothing gets done, or things get done 5 years after they should have. There's this, I think, important need at a lot of companies to really have an iconic leader. You don't want to irritate people, but if you read any book about Steve Jobs, you'll realize that he was not the nicest guy in the world.
Well, that's for certain. And especially when you read about somebody like him, you get pretty tired after a while.
You do, but when you think about the number of industries that Jobs and Apple have transformed, I mean, music.
I meant tired physically, actually.
Yeah. Well, the Age of the Platform came out before the Isaacson book came out, which I think was something like 550, 600 pages.
Mm-hmm.
But I actually blew through that book because I thought, wow, this is really the warts and all. This isn't just sort of a glossified book, sort of minimizing the guy's faults. This really goes into everything. So I found that book fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the one, like I was saying earlier in the program, was The Journey is the Reward, which was actually the first biography, if I understand it, was written by him. and then I was waiting on the second one. Now, in the age of the platform, first of all, I was kind of surprised that Facebook was considered to be within the top 20 of the most hated companies.
Right, right. Well, it's interesting because when you have 845 million users, and let's say that you irritate 10% of them, either a privacy change or a change in the user interface or the layout of the design of the site, you're going to make a lot of people angry, and that's actually something that is really common to all of these. I mean, there are plenty of people out there who won't use Google products because they don't like what Google's doing and they think they're becoming evil. So, again, as I write in the book, platforms are not elixirs. It's not like you can take a dying business like, say, beepers and apply a platform strategy to it because nobody buys beepers anymore.
Right.
So that technology has sort of passed. But you're going to make enemies, and that's just, it's like anything else, right? Try to get 845 million people to agree on anything. Try to get 845 people to agree on anything.
Right. I know the other thing, too, is that you mentioned, or you talk about Microsoft was one of those kind of companies.
Well, they still are. In fact, the interesting thing about Microsoft is that with the sole exception of Xbox, it is still primarily an enterprise brand. And if you look at Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google, these are all consumer-oriented companies. In fact, one of the things I do when I give a keynote speech is to get everyone in the audience to stand up before I even start talking. And I'll say, okay, sit down if you use Amazon. And 60 or 70% of the audience immediately sits down. Sit down if you use Apple and its products. By the time I get to Facebook, no one's standing up. In fact, in D.C. in December when I gave a keynote, I went through Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google, and there was one guy standing up, and the question was, what cave do you live under?
He probably still had a black and white television for all we know.
Right. But again, I'm hard-pressed to think of 4 companies that have had that kind of impact and are so ubiquitous. But the point is, and as I do in some of the other examples in the book, this isn't just the strategy of 4 companies. Every time, I can't turn on the TV or read an article without hearing about emerging platforms. So in the back of the book, I get into things like WordPress and Force.com and LinkedIn and Twitter and other businesses that are embracing the platform as its business model.
I know what's really fascinating when you talk about Twitter is just how influential that becomes, especially in world events, for people to actually begin to take action. For instance, the downfall of the minister of Egypt, for instance.
Right.
And you take a look at the fact that technology is at an age now where people begin to feel that they have more control over a lot of things. You take a look, for instance, at mainstream media. First of all, they had the end. That was it. And you talk, of course, about the earlier tycoons or the robber barons, if you will, in business. These people were literally cutthroats. You couldn't even get started if you were somebody who wanted, for instance, to, you found an oil field, but how are you going to get into playing the game? Or you developed a telephone technology that was perhaps leaps and bounds ahead of AT&T or Bell. But you couldn't get into the game even if you had the money by the time you got started. Forget about it. It was all over with.
Yeah, it's really been fascinating, and I'm a big reader, as you probably tell, in student history. So I do, in Chapter 2 of the book, discuss other platforms and address the question whether, say, Google is a monopoly. And I say no, even though some people disagree, because, like you said, anybody can start a company these days for a fraction of what it would have taken, forget 100 years ago, even 10 years ago. As I've discussed in some of my previous books, with cloud computing, with open source software, with broadband and mobility, you can get a company going now for $5,000. And the barriers to entry are really just virtual. They're not physical. We're not talking about laying billions of dollars worth of cable for a phone company or building a railroad that goes across the country or starting an oil company. So because of that, it really drives the innovation at these companies. Google is very aware of, say, Clayton Christensen's book, The Innovator's Dilemma. You don't want your business to be cannibalized, but it's going to happen. The only question, as Steve Jobs asked at one point, who's going to cannibalize your business, you or your competition? Well, it might as well be you.
Right, exactly. I know what was really astounding, too, is that you draw some parallels when it comes to customers and advertising. One of the things that Facebook has notoriously been hammered by is, how they first of all will take a look at your personality profiles and everything that you talk to, or people, the information that you share that was allegedly private, and they sell that information, and the next thing you know, you may be fed these ads, whether it's through, your email, for instance, or what they maybe put on your page. I don't use Facebook a whole heck of a lot, so whereas Amazon did more of the soft, the user permission approach. So I suppose that if you're going to start a business, this would be one of them vital areas that you want to consider in working with people, so you get more cooperation rather than, competition or sticking it to somebody's face, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're all more similar than people would believe, Daniel. I don't look at Facebook as inherently evil, and you touched on something in your question. You're talking about information that users choose to share. Nothing is obligatory, and yes, Facebook has absolutely overstepped its bounds in the past, and there are examples that I cover in the book. While I have a lot of admiration for these companies and their leaders, I like to think that I can call a spade, and when Google or Facebook has overstepped its bounds, I'll make note of that. But no one forces people to use Google or Facebook. There are private social networks out there if you're into that, or you don't have to use social networks, period. The other thing I would just point out is that these are companies that need to make money. Employee salaries cost money. Servers cost money.
And again, I wasn't actually bemoaning Facebook at all, because my attitude is, they made themselves with something that people believe they want to use. Even furthermore, it's free. So, but free does have a price, and I completely agree with you. And again, it wasn't to make them evil. I think the outcome of what Facebook had created actually became evil by the way other people were using it. When a teacher, for instance, loses their job because they go on vacation to Ireland, they're hoisting a pint of Guinness, somebody take, a picture of that, and then all of a sudden that leaks out and she loses her job as a teacher. You think, okay, that's getting a little ridiculous, but there are some things working on that. But the idea, like, for instance, how Amazon, as you were pointing out in the book, has a soft approach to actually serving you and making your needs more efficient, sort of a thing.
Sure, and it's interesting because if you look at, say, Amazon in comparison to a company like Best Buy, Amazon's recommendation engine is 100 times better. For instance, my favorite TV show is Breaking Bad. It's about a high school chemistry teacher who has cancer and decides to start manufacturing crystal meth. Well, if you look at your history, which Amazon's constantly doing, not just for you, but for the millions of people that use it on a daily basis, it is aggregating the recommendations. It is compiling the ratings. So if you liked Breaking Bad, then you might like Mad Men. You might like Sopranos. You might like The Wire. Best Buy will just do a match on the word bad. So if you like Breaking Bad, it'll recommend The Bad News Bears, which, don't get me wrong, that was one of my favorite movies as a kid, but that has absolutely nothing to do with a high school chemistry teacher who's selling meth.
No, just an alcoholic baseball coach.
Right.
Now, okay, let's go ahead and start from the basics as people are listening here. The book is The Age of the Platform. Our guest today, Mr. Bill Simon. That somebody has a business idea. Let's go ahead and take the example that I had earlier, sewing. That here's somebody that can actually sew, whatever you need. So they think, okay, well, I'd kind of like to launch this and start making this a viable business. Now, knowing that you don't know probably a whole heck of a lot about sewing, talk about how somebody could approach this in lieu of what a platform is.
Sure. Well, this is actually kind of interesting, and I'm surprised that I know this, but did you know that the number 2 most illegally downloaded thing on the Internet after music is stitching patterns?
Wow.
Yeah, I didn't know that, but I read it and I couldn't believe it. So to me, if you're in the sewing business,
you didn't just look that up on Google or Facebook, did you?
I promise you, my friend, I am not in front of a computer. I just happen to know a lot of weird things, but that's a separate discussion for another time. But in any event, so if you're in the sewing business, then why aren't you doing anything with knitting or crocheting? I'm sure without even going on, say, iTunes or on an Android app store, there have to be apps that help you with sewing. There are 500,000 apps in the App Store. There's no way that it's lacking something that so many people will use. So can you get involved in knitting? Is it possible to, if not create your own app because you're not technically savvy, work with a company? Can you leverage existing apps? Can you have a presence on different platforms? One of the points that I make in the book is that you can create your own platform in a relatively short period of time, and one of the easiest ways to do that, in my opinion, is to be active on existing platforms. So, for instance, maybe you have curated a list of books on sewing that you enjoy through Amazon or a site like Goodreads. Maybe you're active on Facebook or Twitter. So maybe you're, as I said, using these existing platforms as planks in your own. Again, I don't know a great deal about sewing, but to me, it takes very little time to set up a proper Facebook fan page. Even if you choose not to disclose that you're in Ireland having a pint of Guinness, you can still build a tribe. You can still track people who have chosen to like your page and communicate with them. So again, that's just a few things that I would recommend. Even though I don't know a great deal about sewing, why not spend a few minutes every day on Twitter, right? Listening and seeing what people are tweeting about. One of the biggest mistakes, Daniel, that people make with regard to Twitter is that they use it to shout. They don't use it to listen. See what's trending. Look at different hashtags. Right? I mean, it's a great communication mechanism, but most people forget the fact that it can be two-way. So it's very easy to use tools like Hootsuite, which I use to track certain keywords. That way I'm not trying to go through an indefinite page with millions of tweets, but I can actually pay attention to references to a book or a TV appearance or a keyword like platforms.
It's quite amazing to think what's available out there, and that, like you said, you can start for as little as $5,000 or even free, depending on, speaking of free, for instance, we moved actually from being on terrestrial stations, which if anybody wants to start a radio show, I recommend you go that direction because you need to understand there is a business side. And as you were talking about in your book, because people have the ability to start up and launch a radio show almost within minutes. The same as with YouTube, you have the ability to get going and actually create your own videos and put those online. But I was talking with somebody, this was just a couple of months ago, just about that very phenomenon. And I said, it's beautiful that we've kind of sort of eliminated the overhead of having to go into a physical station and that you pay for this every month, because the thing that you eliminate is the advertisers eating up a lot of your airtime, which takes away from your content. Nobody wants to sit around and listen to somebody else talk about their business all day long. They really just don't want to do that. They want to know of something that's viable, something that's interesting, something they can use, something that's applicable, or just something interesting to talk about. But what we were talking about in this instance is that when people can have the ability to create, for instance, a free online radio show or a very, very low-cost online radio show, they don't really tend to have the quality that somebody who had to go out there and get the ratings and develop those kinds of qualities had. And so you really start seeing the cream rise to the top, and you actually talk about that in your book, that, just because you can go ahead and you've got all this access to things, you'd better really work on the quality. And that was really in the instance for like in the music business. That was kind of one of them things that they were sort of gatekeepers of, is they had a lot of professionalism in that.
Oh, sure. And we can look at music, we can look at movies, we can look at publishing. Anyone these days, there are myriad companies out there that will take whatever manuscript you have and turn it into a book. But as somebody who's written for and talks to a lot of authors, to me, you can tell usually within 5 minutes if the book has this kind of quality and attention to detail. It doesn't mean that, like you said, certain self-published books I've seen, quite frankly, look like they were bound and printed at Kinko's. And there could be amazing content in them, but if people don't spend the time and the attention and the money on the cover by using professionals, then it looks like something, like you said.
Believe me, I've seen those.
Right. So it's the same thing. I mean, it is tough out there. When the price of anything goes to zero, everyone who can do it will do it, right? And like you said, with you can use Blog Talk Radio or something, and you can be up and running with a radio show in 5 minutes. But like you said, that doesn't mean that the people who are creating those shows are spending the time with the proper equipment, right, or the editing software that sometimes, there is something to be said for gatekeepers, but we've really seen the elimination of a lot of gatekeepers, which to me makes companies like Amazon or Google or Facebook all that more valuable. It's because, or the rating system, say, for apps in the App Store, you've got 500 apps. If you pick one for productivity, right, I guarantee you that you're going to see this enormous list. But one of the easiest ways to find the most popular apps is to sort by ratings. So that's why these companies' use of technology, to me, really help distinguish them and also help them in the long term. If I have an app and people like it and I tell people about it, and I actually do have an app for my last book, The New Small, then other people actually have a means of not just finding a needle in a haystack, but actually sorting by what's popular. So, yeah, these companies' use of technologies, I think, in part helps get around the amateur problem that I discuss in the book.
And I think what's really fascinating, too, about what you write about, and I always, I believe this, too, Phil, is that when you take a look at these large companies of the past, and even, when you come up to date a little bit, using Microsoft could be one of those examples, is that they tend to stand alone, and that any competition was usually quelled, squashed, or whatever. There's just not enough, people on this planet for you to come in here and take that away. I was even given an example, to some friends sometimes, when it comes to the network marketing business, that people would get out there and they'd post these signs on telephone poles that say, would you like to earn $200,000 to $4,000 a month part-time, and somebody went along with a box cutter and cut out half the number, and so they're blatantly saying, what are you doing with your sign here? I'm taking this down. Maybe they were competition, but it's like no one person or even one company can serve everybody. So what they did, especially Amazon, was one of those examples that you used that would actually say, well, why don't I go ahead and pull my competition into cooperation, because then they get to bear or at least leverage some of those risks.
It's an interesting topic, and in the book I write about co-opetition and frenemies. So we'll see how, with the Gang of Four, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google, they'll play nice, kind of like kids in a sandbox, or maybe if you remember that old game, that Risk.
Right.
You'd have an alliance with somebody, right? And all of a sudden you decide that you can take them out.
Well, look at The Apprentice, for instance.
Okay.
Work as a team, but then eliminate the teammate that was least valuable.
Right. So these companies, like you said, will often collaborate on projects, but then it's not uncommon for these platforms to go to war, or for these existing platforms to really challenge the status quo or the powers that be. Case in point, if you look at Amazon and traditional publishers, they have a love-hate relationship. On one hand, if those books aren't on Amazon, the sales are going to suffer. It's that simple. But Amazon knows that it needs to have a positive relationship with these publishers, because if people want to buy a book, there are alternatives. I mean, Amazon is the 800-pound gorilla, but there are other means. I mean, I make my books available on the Nook and on the iBooks and e-reader formats. So it's often a very tenuous relationship, and it's not uncommon for these companies to all of a sudden start to battle each other. But it's almost like, if you go back to the Cold War, mutually assured destruction. If Amazon and Apple and Google and Facebook all want to do a lot of harm to each other, they certainly can. But there's a reason that, for instance, Apple allows a Kindle app, so you can buy Kindle books and read them on your iPad. That's an example, I would argue, of co-opetition. Yeah, it's kind of competition, but Apple doesn't want to irritate people who just spent $800 on an iPad and can't read their Kindle books. So it's a very nuanced issue.
Yeah, and, speaking of that as well, I remember, how Steve Jobs, for instance, he took a look at what Napster was doing. And he says, yeah, but, when you go on those kind of websites and you try to download music, it's slow, it can be inconsistent, and it may sound bad at the end. So what does he do is he takes an idea,
right.
He goes out there and he gets the cooperation of the publishing companies of the music or the videos or whatever, creates the iTunes, and he says, now you can get these speedy downloads,
right.
They're going to be of high quality,
yes.
and you have good karma.
Right. Now, that doesn't, as you know, Daniel, eliminate the problem of piracy. If you
no,
want
of course
to download
not.
music, then, in fact, the ratio I've heard is that for every song legally downloaded, something like 25 songs are illegally downloaded.
Right.
But you're right. You're not going to stop an 8-year-old kid or a 10-year-old kid from doing it. But if you're a professional person and you value your time, is it worth it for you to try to download 6 versions of a song? And like you said, there's a virus in them, the audio quality is poor, versus, 99 cents, I like the artist, I know it's going to work, I know it's going to be of a certain quality. So, yeah, Jobs' efforts in corralling the support of the music industry should not be underestimated. I mean, now it seems obvious, but back in the day, those companies were fighting tooth and nail, and I've read several books about how the music industry resisted digital tooth and nail.
The book is The Age of the Platform. Our guest today, Mr. Phil Simon, and I encourage those people out there who are considering getting ready to launch a business, whether it's to serve the public or that you actually have a product itself that you think that is very innovative. This is definitely something that you want to pick up and read because, going out there with a lack of information certainly is a poor way to arm yourself. Agreed?
Oh, no argument here. Even with all the information, nothing is guaranteed. But certainly, if you know not necessarily all the right answers, but a lot of the right questions. And I really pride myself in the book. Like I said, I don't have a 10-point checklist in there to be the next Google or Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
But I like to think that the book provides a framework. And then I knew that this was going to start a discussion on platforms, which, of course, I continue on theageoftheplatform.com.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating stuff. I want to thank you for being here on the Beyond 50 radio program. If you could, Phil, go ahead and give out the listeners your website where they can find out more.
Sure. My main website is philsimonsystems.com. You can also go to theageoftheplatform.com, or if you just Google Phil Simon, I'm right there.
Very good. It's good to know the little guy has a chance this day and age, isn't it?
It is, but that doesn't mean it's easy.
No. Well, building a good business never really is, and I think the hardest part is that you got to start redefining yourself.
Yeah, it's always a challenge. I think that there are ways to embrace different planks, to embrace platforms, to do some different things, but anyone who's looking for complete certainty these days or wants a 5-year plan on where the world is going, like you mentioned before, and who predicted the Arab Spring a year ago?
Right, exactly. The Age of the Platform is the book. Our guest today, Mr. Phil Simon. Phil, thank you again for joining us here on the program today.
Daniel, I enjoyed it.
You betcha. I want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. Be sure to visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com, the number 50, and sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. We'll also have a post there, so that way you can click on and find out how to get a copy of The Age of the Platform as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.